I used to think I was being practical. That's what I told myself every time I chose the option that paid more and asked for more. Practical men don't complain. Practical men don't chase passion. Practical men build a life that works, even if it feels a little dull. I wore that word like armor while I traded away parts of my life in small, reasonable increments. The first trade didn't feel like a trade. It felt like a win, a better salary, a nicer title, a bigger sense of momentum. I remember the phone call where they made the offer. I paced the kitchen, staring at the wall above the sink like I could see the future written there. When I hung up, my hands were shaking with relief. Not because I wanted the job, because I wanted the safety. That night I told my wife, and she smiled, proud, and I felt my chest swell, the way it does when you believe you've protected the people you love. We talked about paying off debt faster. We talked about options. We talked about the kind of comfort that makes the world feel less sharp. We didn't talk about the price, because the price didn't have a number on it yet. The job started with excitement, the way new things always do. New badge, new desk, new faces, people saying, "We're glad you're here." I remember thinking for a brief moment that maybe this was the turning point. Maybe the stress I'd endured had a destination. Maybe the next chapter would feel lighter. Then the hours began to stretch, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet way that made it easy to deny. One late meeting that became a pattern. One weekend email that became normal. One client crisis that became your problem because you were the reliable one. The paycheck hit on schedule, and the schedule started to own me. The first time I noticed the trade clearly, it wasn't at work. It was at home, when my son asked me a question and I answered without looking up from my laptop. He walked away before I finished my sentence. I told myself he didn't mind. I told myself I would make it up to him later. I told myself later was a plan, but later is just a word that lets you keep doing the same thing. I didn't realize I was selling my time. I thought I was buying a future. I didn't understand the difference yet. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. It felt responsible, which is why it was so easy to repeat. Once I noticed it, it became harder to pretend it was just a busy season. The discomfort wasn't a crisis. It was information I had ignored for too long. Nothing dramatic changed overnight, but the direction started to shift. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. The money did what money always does at first. It smoothed things out. It made problems quieter. Bills didn't feel like threats. We stopped checking the bank app with that tight feeling in the stomach. We took a vacation and didn't put it on a credit card. We bought groceries without doing math in our heads. Those are real forms of relief, and I don't pretend they don't matter. But something else happened too. As the money increased, my standards increased with it. The life got nicer, and the life got harder to leave. We upgraded little things because it felt responsible. A better car because the old one was unreliable. A bigger house because the kids needed space. New furniture because the old stuff looked tired. It all made sense. It all had reasons. And every upgrade quietly raised the minimum amount of stress I had to tolerate to keep it. I didn't see it as a trap. I saw it as progress. People around me celebrated it. Family members said, "You're doing well." Co-workers teased me about the nicer car in the parking lot. I accepted the compliments like proof that my choices were correct. At night, though, I started waking up at 3 a.m., not with panic, just with a mind that wouldn't shut off. I would stare at the ceiling and think about the next day's meeting, the next client issue, the next deadline. The money had bought stability on paper, but it had also bought a new kind of pressure, the pressure to maintain what I'd built. One evening, my wife and I sat on the couch, the TV on, but neither of us watching. She asked, "Mar, are you okay?" In a way that wasn't casual. As I said, "Just tired." That's what men say when they don't want to open the door. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "We have more money, but we see less of you." It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation, and that's what made it painful. If she had yelled, I could have defended myself, but she said it like a fact, like the weather. More money, less me. I wanted to argue. I wanted to list the benefits. I wanted to tell her this was the season we had to push through. Instead, I just nodded, because the truth was I had been using money as a reason to disappear. Not intentionally, not cruelly, just gradually, the way good people drift into lives they never meant to live. The job was paying me well. It was also teaching me how to be absent while still being home. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. It felt responsible, which is why it was so easy to repeat. Once I noticed it, it became harder to pretend it was just a busy season. The discomfort wasn't a crisis. It was information I had ignored for too long. The worst part about trading time for money is that the trade doesn't happen in one big decision. It happens in dozens of small agreements. You barely notice. You say yes to one extra project. You answer one email during dinner. You cancel one weekend plan because this needs to get done. You tell yourself you're being responsible. You tell yourself it's temporary. Temporary becomes your personality if you repeat it long enough. I remember a Saturday my daughter had a school event. She was nervous about it. She asked me the night before if I would be there. I told her yes. I meant it. Then a client problem blew up Friday night, and my boss texted, and the panic started moving through the team like electricity. I went anyway, but I went half present. I stood at the back of the room with my phone in my hand, responding to messages while my daughter looked for me in the crowd. I caught her eyes once. She smiled like she was relieved I came. Then she saw the phone and her smile dimmed. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't notice. Fathers notice. On the drive home, she talked about her day, and I kept saying, "That's great," at the right moments. I sounded supportive. Inside, I felt sick. I had been physically there and emotionally gone, and I couldn't blame anyone but myself. That night, after the kids were asleep, I opened my laptop again. The screen light hit my face in the dark living room. I saw my reflection faintly in the glass, and I looked older than I expected. Not older in age, older in spirit. Like I had been worn down by decisions I kept calling practical. I thought about all the times I said, "I'm doing this for you." I wondered if my family would have chosen it the way I did. I wondered if they would have preferred less money and more of me. The question hurt because it had an obvious answer. The next week, a co-worker got laid off. Good worker, loyal, smart, gone in a single calendar invite. Watching that happen did something to me. It reminded me that the money wasn't a contract. The job wasn't a promise. I was trading away irreplaceable hours for something that could vanish without warning. I didn't quit, but I started to see the trade as a trade. That's a different kind of awareness. It makes you less willing to donate your life for free. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's when the discomfort begins to turn into a decision. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. It felt responsible, which is why it was so easy to repeat. Once I noticed it, it became harder to pretend it was just a busy season. The discomfort wasn't a crisis. It was information I had ignored for too long. Nothing dramatic changed overnight, but the direction started to shift. My old belief was that more money meant more freedom. That's the story everyone sells. Earn more, and you'll have more choices. The problem is that the money only turns into freedom if you protect it with boundaries. If you don't, it turns into a leash. I didn't protect it. I let my life expand to match the paycheck. I let the job consume the extra time it required, and then I spent the rest of my time recovering from the job. That's not freedom. That's a cycle. I started noticing how my weeks were shaped. Monday was dread. Tuesday through Thursday was survival. Friday was relief. Saturday was recovery. Sunday was anxiety. That pattern is so common. People joke about it, but jokes are often just pain with a smile. One morning, I took a sick day. I wasn't sick. I was empty. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and listened to the house while everyone else was gone. The quiet felt almost violent, like I had been living in noise for years and forgot silence existed. I wrote down how many hours I had worked the week before. Then I wrote down what I had been paid for those hours. I divided it and stared at the number. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt obscene, not because it was high or low, but because it reduced my life into a rate. Then I asked myself a question that changed how I saw everything. If I could buy back 1 hour of my life, what would I pay? Would I pay the same amount I was earning? Or would I pay more because that hour with my daughter or my wife or my own mind was worth more than any meeting? That question made the trade visible. The job had a price, and I had been paying it without checking the receipt. That afternoon, my manager called and asked if I could just jump on a quick meeting. I almost said yes by reflex. Then I heard myself say something new. "I'm out today," I said. "I'll catch it tomorrow." There was a pause on the line, and then he said, "Okay." No drama, no punishment. The fear that kept me obedient had been exaggerated in my head. I hung up and realized I had been donating my time not because it was required, but because I was addicted to being needed. Being needed feels like purpose when you don't know what you want. But purpose that steals your life isn't purpose. It's a habit. That day didn't fix everything. It just proved something important. The trade can be renegotiated. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. It felt responsible, which is why it was so easy to repeat. Once I noticed it, it became harder to pretend it was just a busy season. The discomfort wasn't a crisis. It was information I had ignored for too long. The renegotiation started with small moves. I stopped answering emails during dinner. Not perfectly, but intentionally. I left my phone in another room when my kids talked to me. I started taking lunch outside, even if it was just a walk around the block. Those are not dramatic life changes. They are tiny rebellions against a system that wants your attention all the time. At work, I began asking for clarity. When someone wanted something urgent, I asked, what would break if it waited? Half the time, nothing. When someone asked me to take on another responsibility, I asked what I should drop. That question is uncomfortable because it forces adults to admit priorities. Most workplaces survive on the illusion that everything can be done if you just sacrifice yourself enough. My wife noticed the changes before I did. One night she said, "You feel more here." I didn't even know I had left, not in a way I could name, but she could feel it. The bigger change, though, was internal. I stopped fantasizing about a future where I would finally rest. I stopped thinking, once we hit this number, I'll slow down. Because I had hit numbers before and I hadn't slowed down. The target always moved. The job always found a way to make just one more year sound reasonable. I started to see the upgrade trap for what it was, comfort that demands your constant attention. I had built a life that looked good and felt expensive to maintain, not only in dollars, but in hours. I began asking quietly which parts of that life were actually ours and which parts were just evidence for other people. One weekend, we did something simple. We drove to a park and sat in folding chairs and watched the kids run. No schedule, no restaurant, no performance. I felt restless at first, like my body expected to be stressed. Then the restlessness softened. I realized I had forgotten how to be present without earning it. That's the real cost of the trade. It doesn't just take your time. It trains your mind to be elsewhere. It teaches you to experience life as something you'll get to later once work calms down. Work doesn't calm down. It shifts. It multiplies. It finds new names. The only thing that changes is whether you keep giving it your life. I wasn't done working. I just stopped pretending that work should be allowed to take everything. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. It felt responsible, which is why it was so easy to repeat. Once I noticed it, it became harder to pretend it was just a busy season. The discomfort wasn't a crisis. It was information I had ignored for too long. Nothing dramatic changed overnight, but the direction started to shift. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. The moment it really hit me happened in a grocery store parking lot. I had just left work after another long day, and my phone rang. It was a coworker, apologetic, asking if I could help with something. I pulled into a spot and listened as he explained the problem. It wasn't an emergency. It felt like an emergency because we were trained to treat everything like a fire. I looked up through the windshield and saw a father unloading groceries with his kids. The kids were laughing, tugging at his sleeve, asking questions. He was answering them, fully there, like he didn't have a second life running in his phone. I sat there with my engine idling and felt something heavy settle in my chest. I realized that man wasn't doing something special. He was doing something normal, and normal had become unfamiliar to me. I told my coworker, "I can look at it in the morning." There was a pause, then relief. "Okay," he said. "Thanks." The whole thing ended. That was the irony. The pressure felt enormous until I refused to carry it, and then it shrank. I drove home and put my phone on the counter. My son asked if I would play a quick game with him. In the past, I would have said, after I answer a few things, that phrase is a trap. Few things become many things, and the moment is gone. This time I said yes. We played on the living room floor. It wasn't a life-changing moment. It was a small, ordinary moment. And I realized how starved I was for ordinary. I realized how much of my life had been spent preparing for a future that was always one step away. Later, when the kids were asleep, my wife and I talked in the kitchen. She asked, "Do you regret it?" Meaning, do you regret chasing the money, the upgrades, the stability? I thought about it carefully. I didn't regret wanting security. I regretted believing security required constant sacrifice. I told her, I don't regret the money. I regret how much of me I handed over for it. She nodded, and the look on her face told me she understood exactly what I meant. That night, for the first time in a long time, I went to bed without opening my laptop. The world didn't end. My life just got a little bigger. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. It felt responsible, which is why it was so easy to repeat. Once I noticed it, it became harder to pretend it was just a busy season. The discomfort wasn't a crisis. It was information I had ignored for too long. Nothing dramatic changed overnight, but the direction started to shift. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. It felt responsible, which is why it was so easy to repeat. The first time I tried to change the pattern at work, it felt awkward, like speaking a language I never learned. A director asked me to own a new initiative, which in our world meant taking responsibility for a moving target. In the past, I would have said yes and figured it out later. That was my specialty, absorbing uncertainty and turning it into a plan. This time I asked, what gets deprioritized? I said it calmly, like it was a normal question. The room got quiet. Not angry quiet, thinking quiet. People glanced at each other because they realized I was asking them to do the part they usually avoided, choose. The director tried to keep it vague. We'll adjust, he said, which is what people say when they want the benefits of your effort without the discomfort of a decision. I didn't argue, I just repeated the question in a different shape. If I take this, I'm dropping something. Which thing are you willing to drop? He frowned for a moment, then nodded. Okay, he said, let's take X off your plate. It was that simple, not easy, simple. The system didn't collapse when I stopped volunteering to carry everything. I realized how often I had been sacrificing my time, not because anyone demanded it explicitly, but because I was trying to be indispensable. Indispensable is a dangerous goal. It makes you proud while it drains you. Later that day, a coworker pulled me aside and said, half joking, "Look at you setting boundaries." He meant it as a compliment, but I heard the truth underneath it. I had been so available for so long that normal limits looked like rebellion. On the drive home, I thought about the minimum life I was protecting. Not the minimum payment or the minimum savings. The minimum life, the baseline amount of time and attention my family deserved from me, the baseline amount of quiet my mind needed to stay healthy. I had been treating that minimum as negotiable, like it could be borrowed against whenever work got loud. That's the trick. Money has a clear number, time doesn't. You can always steal it from yourself and pretend you'll pay it back, but there's no account where the hours return. There's only your memory of what you missed. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote 2 lines on a piece of paper. Money is a tool. Time is the point. I didn't tape it to the wall. I didn't announce it. I just kept it in a drawer, like a private agreement with myself that the trade would no longer happen silently. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. It felt responsible, which is why it was so easy to repeat. Once I noticed it, it became harder to pretend it was just a busy season. The discomfort wasn't a crisis. It was information I had ignored for too long. I still work hard. I'm not pretending I became a different person overnight, but the trade is different now because I see it clearly. When someone offers you more money, the question isn't only how much. The question is how many hours, and how much of your mind, and how much of your family, and how much of your own peace. The biggest lie I believed was that time is renewable. It feels renewable because there's always another week, another month, another year. But time is the only thing you don't get back, and that makes it the most expensive thing you own. Money can solve real problems. It can remove real stress. It can give your family stability. I'm not romanticizing poverty. I'm talking about something more subtle. The moment money becomes the reason you stop living, you've crossed a line you won't notice until years have passed. If I could go back, I'd still provide. I'd still chase improvement, but I would protect my time the way I protect my money. I would treat my attention like a limited resource. I would be suspicious of any job that rewards you for being permanently available, because what it's really rewarding is your willingness to disappear. The trade doesn't end. Life requires work. Responsibilities are real. The difference is whether you're making the trade consciously or letting it happen by a default. Now, when I feel that old reflex, the need to answer immediately, the fear of disappointing people, the guilt of saying no, I pause and ask myself a simple question. Is this worth an hour of my life? Not in theory, in reality. An hour of my actual time, with all the things it could contain. Sometimes the answer is yes. Often the answer is no. And when the answer is no, I let it be no, without explaining myself into exhaustion. That's the quiet change. I stopped confusing money with meaning. I stopped confusing being busy with being valuable. I stopped believing I could buy back my life later. Later isn't guaranteed. So I'm here now, and that, more than anything, is what the money was supposed to buy. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment, because each step looked reasonable on its own. It felt responsible, which is why it was so easy to repeat. Once I noticed it, it became harder to pretend it was just a busy season. The discomfort wasn't a crisis. It was information I had ignored for too long. Nothing dramatic changed overnight, but the direction started to shift. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own. It felt responsible, which is why it was so easy to repeat. Once I noticed it, it became harder to pretend it was just a busy season. The discomfort wasn't a crisis. It was information I had ignored for too long. Nothing dramatic changed overnight, but the direction started to shift. I didn't recognize it as a trade in the moment because each step looked reasonable on its own.